Currently, the global political situation is more tense than ever since President Trump took office. He has signed a series of executive orders impacting both the economy and military affairs worldwide, with the most notable being the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. In a recent move, President Trump posted on his X account about a phone call with his Russian counterpart, President Vladimir Putin, regarding the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Most recently, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with other officials, held talks at the Diriyah Palace in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on February 18th. Just before the meeting in Riyadh, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that he was unaware of the negotiations between Russia and the U.S. and had no intention of recognizing the results of the talks. Despite being a directly involved party, Ukraine was not invited to participate in the negotiations in Riyadh. The main reason why negotiations regarding the Russia-Ukraine war primarily take place between Russia and the U.S., without direct participation from Ukraine, stems from the following political, military, and diplomatic factors. Firstly, the U.S. is Ukraine's primary sponsor. Ukraine receives massive military, financial, and diplomatic support from the United States. Since the war broke out in 2022, the U.S. has provided over $75 billion in aid, including weapons, financial assistance, and humanitarian support. Washington plays a crucial role in determining the level of military support, as well as Ukraine's policies toward Russia. Therefore, any peace agreement must be approved by the U.S., as Ukraine cannot make decisions independently without considering U.S. interests and commitments. Secondly, Russia's perspective on the war. Russia does not view the conflict with Ukraine as a mere war between two neighboring countries. Instead, Russia perceives it as a larger confrontation between Russia and the West, particularly the United States. The Kremlin believes that the U.S. is using Ukraine as a tool in a long-term strategy to weaken Russia's influence in Europe and globally. Russia argues that Ukraine is not an independent party in this conflict, but rather a pawn in the U.S., its political chessboard. From Russia's perspective, critical decisions related to the war are not in Ukraine's hands, but in Washington's. Therefore, Russia believes that genuine peace negotiations can only take place directly with the U.S., not with Ukraine. President Putin has repeatedly emphasized that without the support of the U.S. and NATO, Ukraine would not be able to continue fighting. Russia asserts that military, financial, and political aid from the West is the decisive factor enabling Ukraine to sustain its resistance. This reinforces Russia's view that this war is essentially a proxy conflict between Russia and the West. Thirdly, Ukraine has limited autonomy at the negotiating table. With Ukraine's firm stance, President Zelensky has asserted that Ukraine will not negotiate with Russia unless Moscow fully withdraws its troops from Ukrainian territory. This is a strong position, demonstrating Ukraine's determination to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, the reality is that Ukraine cannot unilaterally force Russia to comply. Russia holds greater military and political leverage, and achieving a peace agreement would require more practical concessions, such as territorial compromises or a ceasefire. Moreover, Ukraine is currently heavily reliant on the West and the U.S., meaning it lacks sufficient autonomy to make independent decisions without Western approval, particularly from the U.S. If the U.S. and Russia reach a tacit agreement, Ukraine would almost certainly be forced to accept it, even if it contradicts Kiev's desires. This highlights Ukraine's dependence on major powers in shaping its own future. The U.S. and Russia seek to control the conflict in their own ways. The U.S.'s goal is to avoid a prolonged war, as it would result in significant economic, political, and military losses. However, the U.S. also does not want Russia to emerge victorious, as this would weaken Western influence in Europe. Therefore, the U.S. is seeking to balance its support for Ukraine with controlling the escalation of the conflict. Russia's goal is to end the war on the most favorable terms, such as gaining recognition for occupied territories or ensuring its own security. However, Russia recognizes that these objectives can only be achieved through direct negotiations with the U.S., not with Ukraine. Above all, the dominance of major powers is evident. Both the U.S. and Russia hold greater influence than Ukraine in shaping the outcome of the conflict. This has led to the two powers preferring to negotiate directly with each other, rather than allowing Ukraine to play a central role in the talks. 5. Historical precedents, major powers. Deciding the fate of smaller nations. History has witnessed numerous instances where major powers determined the fate of smaller nations without their participation. This reflects the power imbalance in international relations. Historical examples. The Yalta Conference, 1945. The US, Britain, and the Soviet Union divided post-World War II Europe without the involvement of Eastern European countries. This led to smaller nations being forced to accept terms dictated by the major powers. The Minsk Agreement, 2015. Germany, France, and Russia negotiated the Donbass conflict without giving Ukraine a meaningful role. This demonstrated how Ukraine was sidelined in critical decisions about its own future. These historical precedents suggest that Ukraine could once again become a passive party in important decisions regarding the current conflict. If the US and Russia reach an agreement, Ukraine might be compelled to accept terms it does not desire. However, there is an exception to this issue. Looking back at the history of a Southeast Asian nation, Vietnam also faced a loss of autonomy in negotiations when its future was determined by larger powers, notably during the Geneva Conference of 1954 and the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, where the US, the Soviet Union, China, and Western nations played dominant roles. However, Vietnam found a way to overcome the impositions of major powers and reclaim its right to self-determination. Reflecting on Vietnam's history, what can we learn? Proactively creating strength on the battlefield. Vietnam understood that in international relations, real power lies not at the negotiating table, but on the battlefield. Instead of relying on negotiations between major powers, Vietnam created irreversible realities through military victories, forcing opponents to acknowledge them. In 1954, the victory at Dien Bien Phu left France with no choice but to withdraw and sign the Geneva Accords, compelling them to leave Vietnamese territory. In 1973, the resistance against the US, culminating in the Dien Bien Phu in the air, the 12-day and night Battle of Hanoi, forced the US to de-escalate and sign the Paris Peace Accords, recognizing their withdrawal from Vietnam. Lesson: to have a voice at the negotiating table, one must first create tangible strength that the opponent cannot ignore. Exploiting conflicts between major powers, Vietnam skillfully leveraged the conflicts between major powers to avoid being completely manipulated by any single side. During the war, Vietnam received aid from both the Soviet Union and China, despite the deep-seated tensions between the two. At the negotiating table, Vietnam always knew how to pit one major power against another, avoiding dependence on a single ally. Examples: at the Geneva Conference, China and the Soviet Union sought to compromise with the West to protect their own interests, but Vietnam insisted on independence. At the Paris Peace Accords, despite the Soviet Union and China wanting to reconcile with the US, Vietnam fought to secure the most favorable terms. Lesson: a small nation can exploit conflicts between major powers to maintain independence rather than letting them dictate its fate. Persisting in an independent stance, refusing coercion. Despite pressure from major powers, Vietnam never accepted agreements detrimental to its national independence. In 1954, although forced to temporarily divide the country, Vietnam did not see it as the end, but continued to fight for reunification. In 1973, despite the US wanting to maintain a pro-American government in the South, Vietnam firmly upheld its goal of national reunification. Lesson: at the negotiating table, even without overwhelming strength, a steadfast stance is essential to avoid being dictated by major powers. Fighting through public opinion and diplomacy. Vietnam fought not only on the battlefield but also through diplomacy and international public opinion. Diplomats like Le Duc Tho and Nguyen Thi Binh used the negotiating table as a front to condemn the US and garner global support. The anti-war movement in the US and Europe played a crucial role in pressuring the US government to de-escalate. Lesson: a small nation can leverage media and public opinion to pressure its opponents, even if it is militarily weaker. Willingness to sacrifice for long-term goals. Vietnam understood that independence could not be bought through compromise, but had to be achieved through prolonged struggle. Despite being forced to accept temporary division in 1954, Vietnam persisted for 21 years to reunify the country in 1975. Despite facing post-war sanctions, Vietnam maintained its sovereignty until it re-established relations with the US on favorable terms. Lesson: In international relations, some goals cannot be achieved immediately, but with persistence, a small nation can turn the tide. Conclusion. Vietnam overcame being dictated by major powers through tangible strength, skillfully exploiting conflicts between powers, maintaining a firm stance, engaging in diplomatic struggles, and persisting to the end. Lesson for Ukraine or any other nation. To have a voice at the negotiating table, one must first possess real strength, employ smart diplomatic strategies, and demonstrate unwavering perseverance.